Growing up in Portland, Maine, I always looked up to my big brother Tommy. He was funny, he was brave, and he was by far the best player on his high school football team. He was so good that his coaches were talking about scholarships by the time his senior year rolled around. But Tommy had other plans, and in 1964, he took a bullet flying a helicopter over in Vietnam. And in typical Tommy fashion, he managed to fly his bird back to base, and he even landed the thing before passing out. Doctors fought to save his life, but sadly, he didn't make it through the surgery, and we lost him. I was 13 when we got the news, and it broke us. It was the worst thing that ever happened to us, and it took 5 long years before we even felt like a family again. But then just as we were starting to shake off the grief and regain some sense of normalcy, the draft happened. I was 18, unemployed, and ripe to be picked out for mandatory military service, and when my parents realized this, they freaked. Mom almost lost her mind thinking that she might lose a second son to the same godforsaken war, and Dad wasn't much better. But unlike Tommy, who wanted to go to Vietnam because he wanted to fly helicopters on Uncle Sam's dime, I had a way out. An old friend of my mom's had a brother in the church, and if he pulled a few strings, he could get me a scholarship for an undergrad course at the University of Maine. And because if I was destined for the seminary, I could dodge the draft and avoid Vietnam altogether. And the plan was for me to skip out once the draft ended. But to my surprise, studying the Bible gave me back a sort of hope that losing Tommy had taken away. Faith proved a potent medicine, so when it came time to leave, I decided to stick around instead. Now for me, the church was all about service, not just God, but to my fellow man, and so I relished any and all opportunities to volunteer with charitable organizations. Naturally, I preferred to work in places which needed that charity most, and this was how I became involved in the Schoolhouse Project. It was started in the late 70s by the Maine Council of Churches as a means of providing Sunday school services to kids in underprivileged areas. They had a chapter down in Florida, one in Oklahoma, and another in Arkansas, but they wanted to open a 4th chapter in the state of Virginia, and they wanted me to spearhead it. I considered it a great honor, so I accepted the offer on the spot. Then in the late spring of 1977, I was headed down to where Kentucky meets the 2 Virginias to start up my Sunday school. Now here's where some of you are going to take issue with the way that I tell this story, and for that I'm just going to apologize in advance. But I once promised a man that should I ever formally retell it, I'd protect the identities of the innocent to preserve what little peace God's allowed them in the time they have left. And so with that in mind, let's just say that I was headed to a little town with the pseudonym of Ashby, and way out in the hollers of Appalachian, Virginia. And for those who don't know what a holler is, it's basically like small valleys which carve up Appalachia's rolling hills, and one of the best words I can use to describe them is arterial. In a 5-mile radius, they might be 15 to 20 of them, all hidden away around the highways on which small towns spring up, with Ashby being one of them. And by the time I got there, coal was the basis of the town's economy, and with the oil crisis plaguing the mid-70s, as you might remember, the town's business was booming. Folks were moving themselves into Ashby by the dozen after getting themselves jobs in the mines. And although the town's 2 churches were enough to cater to the new arrivals, there was no Sunday school teacher to teach the ever-rising number of kids. And that, boys and girls, is where I came in. After renting a small single bedroom in a local boarding house, I set about introducing myself to the local preachers. And then once I had their blessing, I cobbled together a small tent, some chairs, and a chalkboard. I'd once believed that growing a full and attentive classroom would take patience, but from that very first Sunday, my tent was just about full to bursting. I taught the kids all about Jonah and the whale, they always loved that one, and how God can help us out even when all seems lost. And then when it came to feedback from parents, the only complaints seemed to be that there weren't enough chairs. But the next Sunday, almost every set of parents brought some piece of lawn furniture or an old folding chair, just about anything they could get their hands on. And over time, the Virginia chapter of the Schoolhouse Project proved a resounding success. Ashby might have been a poor community, but people were rich in spirit, and through meeting the parents of children I taught, I became familiar with almost everyone in town. Some parents genuinely wanted their children to be taught scripture. Others simply wanted someone to watch them for an hour while they fought through their hangovers. And I came to suspect the mother of a boy named Joshua fell firmly into that second camp. She didn't seem very interested in talking to me when she came to collect him on Sunday mornings. She just appreciated me being there to watch him. And so when little Joshua didn't show up to Sunday school for 2 weeks running, I became a little worried. I called over to his mom's place, a little trailer on the edge of town, and was relieved to hear that Joshua had just been under the weather. But when I next saw him at Sunday school, he still looked very pale, and he seemed much more timid than usual. After giving the kids some paper and crayons and asking them to draw an animal that they think would have been on Noah's Ark, I took Joshua to one side and asked him how he was. He must have been no more than 7 or 8 years old, and he wasn't the most confident of children. But when he told me that he'd been sick and had to stay home, he couldn't look me in the eyes at all. When I asked him what kind of illness he'd been suffering from, Joshua said that he didn't know. He just knew that it made him want to sleep a whole bunch until he suddenly felt better again. That all sounded pretty regular to me, so I didn't press him on it. But before he went back to his seat, Joshua told me about a dream that he had when he was sick. He said that the first time he fell asleep after getting so sick he couldn't stand up anymore, he dreamed that he was walking through a patch of underpants trees. Hearing the words underpants trees in sequence took me so off guard that at first I sort of laughed a little bit. Joshua smiled too as I confirmed what he'd said, and then he told me how these big old make-do dolls come out from behind the trunks of the underpants trees and started to play with him. Now, for those that don't know, a make-do doll is a sort of Appalachian tradition, or at least something that became one over time. The concept was brought over by English and Scottish immigrants in the 1800s and refers to a doll that's cobbled together from old scraps of things, one you make do with. They come in all shapes and sizes, but a lot of make-do dolls are simply cloth sacks that have been stuffed and had faces stitched on them. And so when Joshua said a bunch of make-do dolls came out of the trees, I pictured a bunch of silly-looking sack men with scraps of hair and silly hats, with big old smiles stitched onto their fronts. Joshua said if he had dreams like that every time he got sick, then getting sick wouldn't be so bad. The only thing was, after he had it, he felt worse than ever, and he slept for the longest time before he finally started to feel better again. It's hard to even say this now, but at the time I just sort of laughed. I told Josh that it was the silliest dream I'd ever heard of, and he must have had one heck of an imagination to dream something like that up. He smiled again, and then, before he returned to his seat, he said something which made my heart sink. He said the next time he got so sick he fell down, he hoped that he wouldn't have to sleep out in the woods again. Now, looking back, I'm not sure how I got through the remainder of that lesson, but somehow I sort of powered through it, and usually it was Josh that struggled to look at me in the eye, but when his mom came to get him, it was me that had trouble looking at her. What Josh told me stayed on my mind for the rest of that Sunday, and then the next morning, I used the phone at the boarding house to call the county sheriff's office. A few hours later, a young deputy that I'll just call Isaac arrived at the boarding house, and when I laid out everything Joshua had told me, Deputy Isaac said that he'd make sure little Joshua was being taken care of, but he also warned me that in Appalachia, taken care of was a relative term. Folks had to work so hard and so long just to keep food on the table that even the good ones didn't have the time to watch their kids 24/7. Then if the department went around filing neglect cases on everyone who let their kids run off into the hollers, half the county would be up on charges. Isaac could head over to Josh's place, talk to his parents, even give them a warning, but they weren't going to transform overnight, at least not while their grocery run looked like it came from a distillery. And I knew I couldn't help people who didn't want to change. But I also knew that having the law breathing down their necks might prompt Josh's mom to change their ways, so I was appreciative nonetheless. Isaac called me back a few days later saying the situation likely wasn't as bad as I thought. Joshua had collapsed in the woods all right, but his mom went and found him after sundown following a frantic search. at which point she took him home and nursed him back to health. And as you can imagine, this was music to my ears. I didn't want to cause his parents any trouble. I just wanted to make sure little Josh was okay. And then since there were no more repeat absences and no more strange dreams, I believed that that was the end of my concerns. Another 6 weeks went by without event, and the only sadness I felt was knowing that one day I'd have to pack up and return to Maine. Some might call the place very boring, but to me, the town had such a peaceful simplicity about it. Very little happened in Ashby, and so when something did happen, it was the talk of the town. I remember calling into the grocery store one day, saying hi to Chet behind the counter, and then immediately being hit with, "Hey, Pastor, did you hear about the fire over in Godby Holler?" It turned out that, just as Chet said, there had been a fire in a place called Godby Holler, which, coincidentally, was host to an old abandoned plague town that folks believed was haunted. Still a relative newcomer, I'd never heard of the place when he first mentioned it, but Chet soon filled me in on his history and how if it wasn't for the town of Godby suffering an outbreak of plague just after the Civil War, Ashby might not exist at all. He said scores of poor folks had their homes nailed shut out there, and while an effort was made later to burn the place down, some of the quarantined homes still stood. The holler was way overgrown, meaning you had to be a fool to head in there if you didn't want snake bit. But Chet also told me that even if it wasn't, folks would still avoid Godby Holler like the plague on account of it being haunted. Chet said that he'd already heard rumors that the fire was of spectral origins, that the restless ghosts of the plague victims were trying to finish the job of purifying the place. But in both Chet's and my own humble opinions, the cause was more likely to be a cigarette butt, freshly flicked from some teenager's fingers. The fire had raged all night, then been extinguished by fire crews shortly after dawn, and generally speaking, the townsfolk treated the fire as an isolated anomaly, but in truth, it was the first in a chain of events that, by then, could never be stopped. Around 6 weeks prior to my return to Maine, 3 of Ashby's residents disappeared overnight. One of the men owned a small trucking business, so we'll just call him the trucker, and another was a supervisor at one of the county's few functioning sawmills, so we'll just call him the logger. And both were respectable members of Ashby's community and, from what I can gather, had no prior dealings with the law. But the same could not be said for the third man. And for reasons that'll become obvious, I'll simply refer to this man as the brother. But for now, all you need to know is that the brother was a deadbeat alcoholic who lived in a poorly kept trailer in the same park as little Joshua and his mom. Unlike the other 2 missing men, the brother was most certainly known to the police, and in addition to his long list of priors, he was a constant thorn in the side of Ashby's citizens. He'd drink, he'd steal, he'd start fights, and in what I considered a delicious twist of irony, was the brother of none other than Deputy Isaac. Learning this sparked a deep sympathy in me. Isaac's brother, ever the black sheep of the family, had finally fallen victim to his own poor choices and had no doubt ended up in some serious trouble. It certainly didn't seem to be some innocent and spontaneous vacation, as the 3 men barely knew each other. Neither had they left any kind of note, so given the brothers' history, it was assumed their disappearances were of a criminal nature. Some feared the brother had murdered the 2 men following some kind of altercation and had left after hiding their bodies somewhere. Others suggested a mutually beneficial plot had gone bad. For example, maybe a drug deal had gone wrong. Needless to say, the men did not return, and as time went by, Ashby's residents grew more and more despondent. They launched public appeals, made missing posters, and walked the woods surrounding the town while calling out the missing men's names. Then as the posters and the search parties started to dwindle, so did their hope, and that's when the vigil started. Folks would walk the streets looking somber and holding candles, all silently praying for the missing men's return. I joined every single one, although it filled me with anguish, especially to see Deputy Isaac among the crowd, with a terrible look of grief in his eyes. At the time, I believed his experience as a police officer was robbing him of hope, how he must have seen too many bodies at too many crime scenes to believe the men had taken an impromptu fishing trip or were laying low after a deal went wrong. I approached him and asked if he wanted to talk, but he declined my invitation. Now, maybe a week or so after the final vigil, a hope tree was erected inside one of Ashby's churches. Now, it was little more than a sheet of cardboard cut out in the shape of a tree which had pictures of the 3 missing men attached to it. But joining them were flowers, candles around the bottom, and notes that folks had written expressing hope for their return. It was shaped like a pine tree, simple but beautiful, much like the metaphor the church's preacher used when he said their hope, like God's love, was evergreen. But then one night, somebody slipped into the church under the cover of darkness and trashed that beautiful hope tree in a very violent manner, and the town was shocked to its very core. Ashby was a place where things like that just didn't happen. People respected their neighbors just fine, but that wasn't anything compared to their respect for the sanctity of the church. So to have someone doing something so violent to something that meant so much to folks, people were outraged. They demanded the county sheriff track down the person that did it, and potential witnesses were urged to come forward. People were tense, very tense, and it broke my heart to see those usually peaceful, loving people suddenly turn on each other like they did. Folks who weren't on the best of terms with the missing suffered thinly veiled accusations, and one town meeting descended into a yelling contest before it was concluded. Now, I suppose it was the thought of how close they were to catching the culprit that got people so excited, because in the commission of the crime, the perpetrator had left something behind. It was a mask, a full head cover made of sackcloth, and stitched onto the outside was a smiley face. Everyone in Ashby knew it was a case of find whoever owned the mask and you had your perp, but the sheriff never did locate its owner. But it wasn't the mask owner who left it at the scene, it was someone else. I just didn't find out who until the night before I drove back to Maine when the boarding house I was staying at received a call which was intended for me. It was Deputy Isaac calling, but he didn't sound his usual self as he asked if I was free to talk. When I told him he was welcome to stop by at the boarding house, he told me it was a conversation best conducted in private, and this is why we arranged to meet in darkness a few miles down the road, not far from the entrance to the burned-out Godby Holler. Now, I rather naively believed that I was in for yet another emotional goodbye. A great many of Ashby's residents had been saddened by my imminent departure, and many a tear had been shed, and so I believed the macho man Deputy Isaac didn't want his tears visible to the public, and in a sense, I was correct. They were tears, and there was a goodbye, but Deputy Isaac also had a story for me, one that so shook me so deeply that I still think about it, sometimes daily, even after all these years. And it was after dark when I drove over to the proposed meeting spot, and then after parking my car, I got out and waited patiently for Isaac's arrival. He walked out of the darkness not long after, alone, and with a bottle of liquor in his hand. And I could tell that he was sauced just from the way he was walking, and it was then that I got the impression that it wasn't going to be the emotional goodbye that I believed it to be. In fact, by the looks of him, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a little scared of Deputy Isaac that night, right then. After exchanging a few awkward pleasantries, I asked Isaac what he wanted to talk to me about. He didn't reply right away, and instead he took a long drink from the bottle of his hand while he appeared to gather his thoughts. And when Isaac asked if he could make a confession to me as a pastor, I told him things didn't exactly work like that in the Presbyterian Church. If he wanted to make a confession, he could do so directly to God, because while God sees and knows all, he certainly appreciates a little personal honesty from his children. Isaac said something about how a one-on-one with God wouldn't cut it. Not at that current moment, anyway. And instead, he wanted to jawbone with someone man-to-man, not man-to-God. And I understood, so I asked what he wanted to confess. But before he spoke, Isaac said the only reason that he was talking to me was that I was leaving for Maine in the morning. He asked if I was ever going to come back someday, and when I replied, yes, hopefully, he told me to push that idea right out of my mind. He was about to tell me something that no one could ever know, not anyone who lived around Ashby anyway. And so once he told me, I was to stay away, and for good, too, and if I didn't promise as such, then he wouldn't say another word. And I figured that since Isaac obviously wanted so badly to share what was on his mind, the dutiful thing to do was honor his wishes and swear myself to at least partial silence. Now, once he'd secured my promise, Isaac told me that a few days before the fire in Godby Holler, he bumped into an old coworker while in the next county over.